The critics of the church don't own the truth.
You're just engaging in mental gymnastics in order to try to make Mormonism make sense.
What really saved my faith crisis is education.
What was like that crucial point like for you where you decided to do that rather than just cave in the dissonance?
They're hurt because they feel the church lied to them.
You're not able to deal with, reality.
The more that I read, the more I realized the critics are wrong.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Sword and Spirit. My name is Daniel. I'm here with my co-host David, and today we are joined by the legendary Michael Ash. Mike, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, thanks.
Awesome. Well, we're really happy to have you on today, especially because I think within the apologetic community of those that are writing, I think you're definitely one of what I would say kind of the top tiers that is writing a lot of good work out there. You're presenting this next week at the Fair Conference. Just real quick before we jump into today's discussion, if you could just give us a quick introduction of who you are, your upbringing in the church, what you do for work or for Fair. Just kind of give us a little bit of context of who you are before we jump into your story.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm born and raised in the church. My dad is of Utah pioneer stock, has history of coming out of the wagon train and stuff like that. My mom is German, convert to the church after World War II. And I'm one of four brothers. And like I said, raised in the church, always, we were very active in our upbringing. And so I've, been a lifelong member. And, it's, as far as my association with Fair, I think the very first Fair conference was in California, I believe in 1999, if I'm not mistaken. And I didn't attend that one. I think they had 10 people attend. And then the very next one was in Alta, Utah, and I attended and presented a paper there called Up in Smoke, and it had to do with the word of wisdom. And I became a member, a contributing member from that point forward. And it's interesting because in the very early Fair days of their website, I was producing quite a bit of the material that was on there. It was in PDF articles, very short articles and stuff, and I helped along with Alan Wyatt, who's no longer with Fair, but he's been in the community for a long time, LDS apologetic community. Anyhow, the two of us basically created the original indexing for Fair. So if somebody wanted to, search for article about seer stones or plural marriage or whatever, that we had little kind of hierarchical tiers and alphabetical order so people could find things. And there was a lot of work involved with that. And I've, presented at, gosh, I don't know how many of the conferences now, but I would say on average, maybe not every other one, but close to every other one, or every third one probably is. I've had something to present there, and great group of people, and all like-minded, trying to help people who are struggling within the church, and so it's been a wonderful thing to be involved with. As a profession, I'm the general manager of a retail store that sells both jewelry and cameras. And photography is my passion. That's something I got involved in back when I was in early high school days, maybe even junior high school. My dad was in the military. That's how he met my mom when he was in Germany. And he came back from Korea with a film camera, interchangeable lens camera, and he let me play with it. And pretty soon I had read the entire instruction book and had it figured out, and he ended up giving it to me because I knew more about it than he did, and that launched my my hobby, which ended up being my career ultimately as well, since that's what I mostly do is sell camera gear. So yeah, I've been doing that for 40 some odd years now. So
I love that. That's great. I think you got me beat as far as years with a camera. I similar to photography. I do a lot of video work, and I mean, I edit for our podcast, and I just do a lot of video work. So that's actually really cool that you do a lot of that because camera work is a lot of fun. But that's that's great. That's awesome. I think that was a great introduction just for who you are. And a little bit of what you do for FAIR. You said you present almost every other conference, and I just want to talk about that for a little bit because you mentioned before, or in a previous episode that we had on Scott Gordon. He talked a little bit about the history of FAIR, what is FAIR, and kind of the reason he is a part of it. And obviously Scott is the president of FAIR, but for you, you like you said, you present at a lot of these conferences. So a question I just wanted to start as we go into this discussion of your journey in FAIR is why FAIR? Why is this important to you or even pertinent to your story, your faith journey? Just talk to us a little bit about why you're so involved with it.
Well, it's, I have had in the past, especially when I was younger, my own faith crisis. And, that's kind of really what got me involved in researching for answers. And in the early internet days, before what we have, with, Facebook and Reddit and just all the different discussion forums, stuff like that, I was doing a lot of reading, and I ended up on these text discussion groups where people that were talking about some of these challenging topics, and there was a lot of people that had the same questions and concerns over and over again, and I had read enough books that I knew some of the answers to these, and that's kind of what actually happened with FAIR, as well, is that they wanted to create a kind of repository of these answers so they didn't ever have to retype them over and over again. And I was kind of doing the same thing myself, and then got involved with some of the early members of FAIR that were doing the same thing. And so that's really why I joined, is because, we find that the challenges, for the most part, the challenges that people are facing today for their testimony are not much different than they were a decade ago, 2 decades ago, 30 years ago, and maybe even longer. It's mostly the same questions and concerns that come up over and over again. It's just you've got a new generation of members that are being confronted with it for the first time, and it's wonderful to be able to help somebody see that there's ways to remain faithful members, believe in the church, because there's answers to these challenging questions, and that critics of the church don't own the truth. That there are answers, responses, different ways of looking at things that can overcome these challenging concerns. And sometimes it takes new frames of reference and rethinking things in different ways, and helping people to do that so that they can stay in a faith that them happy, brings them joy, brings them hope, and looking forward to the future, with their families and loved ones. It's great being part of an organization that can help people provide resources so that they can continue to believe. They don't have to jettison their beliefs based on critical arguments.
I really like what you said. Critics don't own the truth. Oftentimes, it seems that, especially with specific tactics critics use, it seems like it's hard to tell. Okay, is this just a half truth, or is this the truth, or like what's going on here? So I really like that, and it reminds me. There was a general authority that was saying something to the effect of, we need to meet critics on the playing field and stop always playing defense the entire time. That they shouldn't get undeserved ground. I really like that. Just these conversations and the research is important to have, and ultimately the majority of the claims or the majority of the criticisms are the same thing they were 20, 30, 50 years ago. I mean, for heaven's sake, when Fawn Brody wrote No Man Knows My History, the arguments she uses, for example, like about seer stones, are not is not unheard of. So these aren't necessarily new accusations or new criticisms. For the most part, like 99% of them are what they've been for a long, long time. And we can certainly dive into maybe a few of those and how you respond to them. But before we do that, I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves. For you, Mike, let's just dive a little bit into kind of how you got like acquainted with fair, because you've done a lot of work for them, and I think we've just highlighted that in this little segment. Let's just start like with your faith journey. Kind of, you said you went through a faith crisis. Maybe we can start leading up to that, and then just kind of go from there.
Yeah. So in the early 1980s, I was newly married. Actually, even before that. So let's back up a little bit more. I would say in probably the early, maybe about right in 1980 itself, I was working at a mall, working at a sandwich shop then, and I was a young man, probably about 20 years old or so. And I would make friends with a lot of the customers that came in, because it was an arcade in the back, and play games and stuff with them, and got into a religious discussion with one gentleman, and he found out that I was LDS, and ended up bringing in a book called Kingdom of the Cults by my mind just went blank here, Walter Martin. And he was a very he was a critic of the time of the church, and he says, you need to read this, and it had sections about Jehovah's Witness and I think Seventh-day Adventists, in a section on Latter-day Saints. And so I read that, and I was never heard any of this stuff before, and I was hurt by it, and very concerned by it, and I didn't know. It's like, gosh, I mean, my heart told me that the church was true, but here were some arguments that I didn't have answers for. It worried me a lot. And so I went to my dad. Again, this is, way pre-internet days and stuff. I went to my dad and asked him, hey, have you ever heard of this and stuff? And he had actually some pretty decent answers on some of them, and it helped me kind of, take away a little bit of that heartburn. Not completely, but it took away a portion of it. I thought, okay, that there's different perspectives, and he's a critic, and he has his own views, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's right. So anyhow, fast forward a couple of years later, newly married, and the movie The God Makers came out, and that was, I don't know, right around maybe 82, 83, something like that. And boy, I was living in Colorado Springs, Colorado at the time, and that was heavily promoted in the newspapers and stuff, and it's like, wow, it's because he's going from church to church doing this, and had my interest. And so I went, and I sat in a back row at this packed congregation in this large church, and he presented his whole, the pastor there played the movie The God Makers, and had somebody come up and talk, and boy, I was shaken. I mean, my knees were weak leaving that, and it's like, oh my gosh, what's going on here? I just don't know what to make of this anymore. And I ended up even buying the book and reading it, because I wanted to go over those details again. And it's like, I don't know how to answer this. And so I went to the local LDS bookstore. This is again in Colorado Springs, so you didn't have Deseret Books everywhere, but there was a bookstore that had some LDS books, and I'd heard of Hugh Nibley, never had really read any of his stuff, and I bought one of his books. I think it was Since Cumorah, his book, and started reading that. And at the time, there were also some pamphlets written by an organization called Farms, which I'd never heard of at the time. Well, Farms had started in 1979, and Dan Peterson, of course, involved in them, and I mean, Bill Hamplin, a bunch of wonderful people, and kind of was the stepping stone to what's now the Interpreter. And so I started gobbling up everything I could read from them, and joined their mailing list, and they had back issues. They'd only been around for a couple of years themselves, and so I ordered everything they had and just started reading everything. And pretty soon I read books and articles, and I subscribed to BYU studies, and I was just devouring all this information. And the more that I read, the more I realized the critics are wrong, or their perspective was wrong, or I might have misunderstood something. That sometimes we get a little bit too set in our thoughts and beliefs that we are very rigid and don't understand there's different ways to look at it. And so as I read, then all of a sudden my faith became stronger, and it's like, okay, the stuff that Ed Decker says in the God Makers is just not accurate, and there's no reason for me to give up my beliefs, because here's a lot of evidences for my belief as well as answers to the critical questions. And so, like I said, that's where I reached a point that pretty soon, because I was doing all this reading, and I just read, like I said, pretty much everything that I could find from Hugh Nibley at the time and from Farms and everything else, that all of a sudden I had answers to these questions. And that's when, like I said, I got on some of these internet discussion groups, and these were all text-based at the time. And I would, help people that were discussing these things. And so, some of the people that were involved in these were some of the early members of FAIR. And so when they held their first conference in California, I didn't have enough funds and time off and everything to get out there. I wish I could have, but I kind of followed what was going on and keeping in touch with some of these people. And then when they came to Alta, Utah, by this time I had moved to Utah, then I could join them. And so, I offered to do a paper there up in Smoke at the Alta conference. And that was very small too. There's probably less than 30 of us, maybe 20 people at the most there at Alta, the first conference, but it was wonderful. And that's right after that's when Scott Gordon took over as the president of FAIR. And so I got to, have face-to-face meetings with, some of these early members of a group that had only been around for a couple of years themselves. And so I, launched myself into helping FAIR as much as I could, between my normal work schedule and family and everything else, to write and to present and do anything I can to help FAIR out. And I've, I love the organization. I've been involved with it, and eventually, that led me to taking some of these articles and things that I've written and turn them into, book publications as well. So that's pretty much my in a nutshell, the journey of my, faith crisis. And what really saved my faith crisis is education, increased education of, and I think that's where sometimes we fall short, is that greater learning actually makes our faith stronger. A lot of times people, say that, so-and-so, they studied their way out of the church. Well, actually it can be the opposite. You can study your faith as a stronger, into a stronger place by reading the right materials.
I love that. That's great. That's great. Nice, simple, and to the point. And I think I think just what you shared was very beneficial, which brings us to where you are today. You write for FAIR, you publish consistently. You wrote some great books like Shaken Face Syndrome. And for those that don't know, I think you kind of highlighted this throughout your story a little bit, but let's talk about that specifically with like your book, Shaken Face Syndrome. What kind of book is that, or what book is that for those that aren't aware of it?
Sure. So basically I thought that, like I said, I'd written a number of articles for FAIR, and at one time before, when I was getting started with the internet, I had even my own little web called Mormon Fortress, and I had a bunch of articles on there as well. And then I converted those to a format that worked for FAIR and would continue to write for FAIR. And I thought, this would be wonderful if we could have all of this stuff under the cover of one book, where people could, pick it up and read at their leisure and not necessarily have to get online to do it. And I also had done a lot of research about cognitive dissonance and psychology and things that affect how we believe and why we believe things and stuff. And so I thought I need to put this in the pages of a book. And so I wrote what I entitled Shaken Faith Syndrome. It was the first edition was published in 2008, and roughly the first half of it talks about the process of thinking and belief, and how our beliefs can be challenged, and what human reaction is when we're challenged with beliefs, and it's basically kind of a synopsis of what happens with any human when they encounter things that cause heartburn to their important beliefs, and why it is like that, and how we can help overcome it. So I spend the first part kind of addressing for Latter-day Saints what to do if our faith is challenged, and the critic's perspective, and how their perspective is very biased. They say Latter-day Saints are biased. Well, everybody's biased, including critics. And I talk about all these things in about roughly the first half, and then the second half I apply those types of things to very specific arguments, everything from DNA to Book of Mormon archaeology to plural marriage to all the most common arguments, and then I show how, if we understand how faith crisis works and how our brains react, and how we can overcome it, how we can apply to these challenging issues, and really prevent them from demolishing our faith. And at about the same time, I was working on another publication that Cedar Fort was looking at, and they ended up publishing a book for me called A Faith and Reason, 80 Evidences for the Prophet Joseph Smith, and I felt like that shaken faith syndrome. It was the shield, it was the defense of the faith. Okay, but I thought there's so much out there that actually is amazing evidence. It's kind of the sword, and it gives reason to believe, not just to defend the faith, but here's reason to believe that Joseph Smith, how could he have known this? How could he have had insights to things that weren't known in his day? And so I wrote A Faith and Reason that was published by Cedar Fort at about the same time. And then in 2013, so 5 years after the first edition of Shaken Faith Syndrome came out, Fair published a second edition, and it's basically an updated version, kind of fine-tuned some of the arguments, add a little bit of extra stuff in there, any typo or whatever corrections that needed to be fixed, change the cover of it, and so forth. But I think did a wonderful update on it to make it even more accessible, and even more detailed in the defense. And the book was also published in German and Italian, and so it's in a couple of other languages right now. So those are the ones that I did earliest on, and then later on, when the CES Letter became extremely popular, I published a short book called Bamboozled by the CES Letter, and so that's another one that's available. And then a couple of years ago, I wrote a tome called Rethinking Revelation that it's like this thick, and so it's a hard read. But I basically expand on some of the arguments of shaken faith syndrome from the psychological aspect, and why we do things, think the way we do, and also I think helping to understand how revelation works. What's the thought process, and in that book I argue to a great degree that Scripture and revelation is a combination of what God reveals and what's going on in our heads. That God doesn't just take over your hand and write what's going down for prophets. That it has to be processed through their worldviews, their perspectives, their biases, and so forth. And it works the same whether it's a lay member of the church, a bishop or Relief Society president, or a prophet. That the revelation works the same way, that it has to work through human brains. And that's why we see certain things in the scriptures that sometimes don't make sense or that reflect the time that it was written. It's because it's being processed by a human brain, and it's not just you know the prophet's not a puppet that's just repeating what the Lord's saying. Is that he's getting a revelation and then has to put it in words that make sense to him and make sense to his audience. And so that's what my Rethinking Revelation book is all about.
Nice. I really love that focus on the psychology and like the human brain and how it functions and what happens to people when they have faith crises and stuff. And as you were writing those books, especially about faith crises and how we react to it, could you like see your past self like as you were writing that? You're like, that was what I did. This is how I got through it. Like that must have been like very like cathartic like for you, like that writing
Yeah,
experience.
yeah, absolutely. Because like I said, a big part of, and I'll be talking about this at the upcoming fair conference on the first week of August, is that a big part of our problem, and this is again not limited to Latter-day Saints, but we see it in the context of faith crisis, is that most people have very narrow thinking windows. That we accept assumptions because they're that's what we've always thought, and the tradition and things like that. We don't always think outside of the box until we're forced to it. So sometimes the way we process things. So I'll give you an example, and this is one I'll bring up briefly at the fair conference. Is that the gold plates? Okay, I mean in the histories it's referred to of for the most part as golden plates or with the appearance of gold and things like that. But a lot of Latter-day Saints have through the years talked about as gold plates, and some members have assumed that these were plates made out of pure gold. And one of the arguments made by the critics is like, okay, based on the description of the dimensions of the plates, if these were made out of gold, they would have been too heavy for Joseph Smith to have carried them running through the forest as he's trying to escape the people that were trying to take him away from him. And that's true. If they're made out of pure gold, that's accurate. He would have been too heavy. Okay, but in Mesoamerica there was material called chumbanga that were part gold and part alloys, silver, copper, things like that mixed in there. And then they were basically they would use a citric acid over top of it to give it a shine that looked like pure gold, but it was made out of alloys, and they were easier to etch on. Gold plates would have been super soft and would have become distorted and stuff like that, and they would have been lighter weight, and they still would have looked like gold. And you think about it, I mean, a lot of people think, well, why were they gold? Well, a lot of people, men and women, wear gold wedding rings, for instance. Okay, guess what? Those are not pure gold either. Like I said, as I work in a jewelry store, Cameron Jewelry Store, 14 karat gold is 58% gold and 42% alloys. But we call them gold rings. It's I want a gold ring. We'll say same thing with this tumbaga. And so if we change our thought process and think, okay, I can accept that pure gold plates, the critics are right on this one, but if we look at the evidence in that there actually was material used in Book of Mormon lands that could have been called gold, all of a sudden this fits better. But it's a matter of changing our frame of reference and not clinging to assumptions that it's like, oh, these must have been pure gold plates. Well, no, they wouldn't have. They would have been had the appearance of gold as Joseph Smith actually described them. So that's one of many types of things that we have to kind of just switch how we look at things, and it makes sense in both a belief aspect and answers to the critics, and it fits it fits the puzzle more clearly when we start rethinking these things.
For sure. And I'm just kind of curious what you would say to this, because a common criticism, I think, in response to the argument or the comment you just made, what is specifically, well, you're just engaging in mental gymnastics in order to try to make Mormonism make sense, and you're not able to deal with reality of being wrong. So I'm just curious for you, what would just be your response to that. I think there's good and rational explanations for these type of things, but that's a common criticism we hear from our critics, is that you're just engaging in in mental gymnastics.
Yeah.
So how would you respond to that?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, because, well, quite frankly, everybody engages in mental gymnastics. That we do that throughout every day of our lives. I mean, we try to make things fit. It has to do with what's called cognitive dissonance, which I talk about in my first book to a great degree. But basically, we like things to be comfortable in our brains, because if they don't, it causes both psychological and even physical turmoil. So we want things to make it fit. So on that aspect, I mean, that's kind of a specious argument, because everybody engages in it. So the reality is, though, that science, history, every type of discipline has to change and has changed their paradigms. And their paradigms are the way you're looking at things, okay? And that's just a normal process of intellectual approach to anything. And so it's not mental gymnastics to look for more accurate answers to things. So if we stuck to the claim that, yeah, the Book of Mormon plates were made out of pure gold, and we stick with that, and we try to come up with some reason why Joseph Smith is like, okay, well, maybe he could bench press 400 pounds, and we had all these assumptions and we stuck to it, then that's kind of mental gymnastics. That's like, this is how he could do it, we're sticking to it. But instead, it's answering, it's like, okay, that's a good point. He couldn't have carried gold. Is there a logical answer to this? And as people explore and Tubaga comes up, it's like, no, wait a minute. This is a type of gold that would have the appearance of gold, that could have been etched on, and that was actually in Book of Mormon lands. So it makes more sense to say, if the Book of Mormon came, if it's real, if we make that assumption, first of all, if it's real and it came from New World, an ancient New World, what kind of gold would these people have had? And they would likely have had something like Tumbaga. Now, if they would have Tumbaga, why wouldn't the Book of Mormon plates be made out of Tumbaga, look like gold? And does that fit, all of a sudden, the weight based on the dimensions? Yes, it does. So, like I said, that's exactly how any kind of intellectual process where science and history and thought is involved is people are trying to find anomalies. That happens when trying to understand astrophysics or microbiology or anything else, is that people encounter anomalies in the research, and it's like, okay, is there do we have to jettison this belief, or is there an answer that works within this that we just don't understand? And so, yeah, it's a silly argument to claim it's mental gymnastics when we're just trying to understand the answers better. But like I said, that's just how human mind works.
Yeah, that reminds me. So I'm being trained as like a historian, and one thing that historians love to do is create models for things, because it helps them understand like the world, because the world's very complicated. But a lot of it does seem like mental gymnastics, because you can always find exceptions to the models, right? And so I think, yeah, we all do that. But for you specifically, so whenever you came across these critical arguments from the God makers, Kingdom of the Cults and stuff, you started to experience this cognitive dissonance where your heart was telling you one thing, but the things you were learning, maybe your mind was at odds with that. And you had this dissonance. So at that crucial juncture between you having dissonance and then you like diving into the literature and trying to solve that, what was like that crucial point like for you where you decided to do that rather than just cave in the dissonance and just leave the church?
I don't know if there was an exact point as maybe a process. The thing that I found is that I had most of my education on LDS issues had come from seminary teachers or Sunday school, whatever, and that was all faith-based stuff. There was really not a lot of intellectual arguments and discussion that it had been involved in. And when I started reading things from Hugh Nibley, and especially from Farms, I mean, that was a huge one for me. All of a sudden, I was reading things from scholars that were experts in Egyptian and Hebrew and Arabic and archaeology and warfare and all these things. And then all of a sudden it opened my eyes to think, okay, if we think of the Book of Mormon, especially to focus on that one, because that's our keystone, right? So if we focus on the Book of Mormon and we try to look at them as real people in a real world setting, how would these things have operated? And I spent a lot of time in Rethinking Revelation, my book on addressing this as well. Because, sometimes, I grew up like a lot of people, and I don't know if that is the same among the younger generation, but I kind of almost envisioned that the Nephites were like the Perry Seventh Ward. The church had the sacrament meeting, they dressed differently, but it was pretty much a lot the same, that the gospel was the same. Well, okay, we're talking about different cultures, different times, different worldviews, different understanding about science and how the universe worked and how the stars worked and everything else. And if we try to understand from their terms how they would have understood things to write scriptures, then all of a sudden the scriptures make a lot more sense. And we can see a little bit more what's going on in it. And so that's really what I was learning reading the material from Farms, is that the beliefs that we accept for the scriptures especially, that they actually fit very neatly into what we know now about ancient old world, American cultures. And that some of the arguments, that for the history of Joseph Smith is kind of the same thing. It's like, okay, well, Joseph Smith lived, several hundred years ago. He would have understood things differently, talked about things differently, perspectives. He didn't already have the gospel and everything to base his beliefs on. He was raised in a Protestant understandings, and all of the stuff came little by little, line upon line. And so his views would have evolved with that as well. And so all of a sudden this stuff makes more sense, and that gave me a lot of comfort, realizing that these arguments were not strong anymore, that they had lost their bite, and that there was actually a lot of evidence in supporting the faith, and then things kind of switched. And so, like I said, it wasn't at one point, it was an overall process, but I attribute that really to a great degree to the material written by Farms.
I love that. That's great. And, there's a lot of great materials out there. We've seen that a bit. As David and I have been interviewing a number of philosophers, historians, scholars, or just apologists. That's one thing that I think we've seen is there are a lot of resources out there to help people with their questions. Whether it's a small question, or something that may seem like a small question, or something that may seem like, a big question, because faith crises are not very fun. So giving people the materials, I think, is very important, and the material is out there. And I think in your book, you do a very great job at just like kind of saying, all right, stop and let's check your assumptions. Let's go back to, rather than saying, oh, you have this, oh, this is what's going on. It's like, well, you have this view that of what's the ideal should be, or that what the real is, but your real is being conflated with your ideal. So it's like, let's go back there, rechecking our assumptions, and adjusting our paradigm is needed. And additionally, with you within your own faith crisis, I think can relate to this. But you mentioned that the God makers, you mentioned the God makers and how it hit you, or how it shook your faith quite a bit. But then you later said that you found it to be inaccurate. And I'm just hoping, could you provide an example for our listeners of when you were researching the God makers or a certain criticism of the church, what you thought was accurate at first, but then later on an example of how you realized or found out that it was inaccurate?
That's a tough one, because that's been 30 years ago or more that I read it, so I don't, and watched the movie. So I don't remember all the exact criticisms in there. It was kind of, lumped together, and they were pretty much a lot of the same criticisms that have evolved through the years. So if I thought of one, I might be misremembering right now what there were. But basically, it was the overall. Like I said, there was a big attack on the Book of Mormon in there, and of course, attack on our temple rituals and things like that as well. So one that maybe comes to mind thinking about that is that uh, there's been quite a bit written by LDS scholars on the early Christian temple beliefs and sacred vestments and other nuances that are kind of that are sacred to Latter-day Saints that we don't really discuss, but in a scholarly setting, LDS scholars have talked about how early Christians, you know, had certain types of tokens and dress and things like that fit in their worldviews of their Christian beliefs at the time, and Latter-day Saints can kind of read between the lines and find how that fits in their beliefs as well. And I read a lot of those things also, and so that's one of several of examples. Then all of a sudden it's like, okay, this is, Ed Decker was poking fun of things that, to me, again, I didn't have a great understanding about, at least from a historical and ancient context. And all of a sudden, when I see that, okay, that's like poking fun at any other religion for their beliefs when you don't have an understanding about it. And then when all of a sudden you see that Latter-day Saint worship, temple worship, has some very close parallels in the early Christian church, then all of a sudden that changes things. That changes, like, okay, he's just trying to throw mud on something that really is not backed up by any solid evidence. That there's evidence that shows that Joseph Smith restored Christian beliefs. There was stronger evidence for that than what Ed Decker was saying, that these were just kind of bizarre things that Joseph Smith made up. And so, like I said, that's one example, but there was a lot of things in there that all of a sudden, the weight of his arguments just diminished, and the strength of the evidence for the things that Joseph Smith has restored were compounded.
And I absolutely love that. And for some listeners who are curious on that specific question, do you have any resources that you would recommend for them as well?
A lot of the material that I have is still based on early Farms material. And there were a number of books that were produced under the Farms and Premature later on. I don't know how many of those have been picked up by the Interpreter, but basically I would recommend, FAIR obviously has, great resource, and most of it's kind of try to be distilled in I don't want to say sound bites, but in easy to consume, and easy to digest articles and things like that. But if you want to get into deeper stuff, look to someplace like the Interpreter, and you have some really solid scholars that have written on pretty much every issue that we could think about. And like I said, I know that Jared Riddick and others have tried to create maybe a catalog or storage area, digital storage for some of the older articles that were written by Farms, so those things don't disappear. So anybody that wants to look up Farms material as well as the Interpreter, you'll get some of the deeper stuff.
I love that. That's great. This just goes back to that. It's important to have the right information, because there's a lot of information out there in our internet age. So I really like that. And just kind of since we're running a little bit low on time, this has been, first of all, this has just been, I think, a great discussion, a great introduction for people that are interested in apologetics, kind of what it is a little bit, specifically what groups like FAIR, the Interpreter Foundation, and others are, which we will definitely be sure to link in our description today. But from today's discussion, Mike, if we've talked about a series of different questions, a bit about your faith journey, if you could just kind of summarize a little bit what we talked about, or if our viewers were to have a specific a specific takeaway from this discussion, what would you have that discussion, or what would you have that takeaway be from everything that we've talked about today?
I would think probably the most important things are that first, recognize that there are answers. There's answers to every single faith challenge that you might be confronted with. The second important point is that those answers may require you to change your thinking about things. Like I said, sometimes Latter-day Saints, like a lot of, I think, Christians especially, we have very fundamentalist points of view. And I don't mean fundamentalist in the sense of like, the plural marriage. We use that term, especially in Utah, referring to the offshoots. But fundamentalist in the sense of black and white thinking. And it's again partially human nature to do that because it's nice and clean, and the brain doesn't like ambiguity. It's looking for very clean answers, and so sometimes black and white thinking is the easiest until you're confronted with a challenge, and then all of a sudden it's very very damaging because not everything fits into black and white categories, and so there's answers for everything, but it does require us to sometimes think outside of the box of what we've thought or maybe assumed. We have to understand that not every word spoken by every LDS leader, even prophets through the ages, is the word of God. It's just not how it is. That even prophets are allowed their own opinions and views and on a variety of topics, and until revelation is given, their view could be right, it could be wrong. God doesn't dictate every single belief and everything about all aspects of our religion to a prophet. Wiping away the fundamentalist view, having the open mind, and recognizing that there are answers, and being open to understanding those answers and be willing to change our perspectives. That's, I think, the most critical part of overcoming a faith crisis. The other thing that's, I think, very important, and it probably won't apply as much to listeners of your vlog here on this, is that unfortunately, faith crisis seems to hit members most frequently because they are unaware that there are answers to it. And so they're not prepared, and they're blindsided. And when they're blindsided, they're hurt because they feel the church lied to them. And then it's like infidelity. There's a relationship, all of a sudden, an issue that goes on. It's like, the church lied to me. It was not faithful to me. And so, I want to break this relationship off. And that's what happens frequently. And so I think it's very crucial that we try to get members to understand some of these complex issues before they're blindsided by them. And the church, I think, has realized that through the years too. And of course, that's why you have, on the church's website, these articles addressing most of these challenging issues now, is because they've realized that very thing is that if we can get this information out there first and talk about it in a faithful discussion, that most people understand and can see, that fits in with my faith. But if they're blindsided and the information first comes from a critic, it can be detrimental and very difficult to overcome. So yeah, answers, changing perspectives, and let's try to teach people before they're hit, broadsided by a critic with stuff they had never heard of before.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for coming on today. This has been a great discussion, great episode on apologetics. And for everyone watching, we'll be sure to link the resources in our description below. But everyone, thank you so much for watching Sword and Spirit, and we will see you all next week.